and to still have the messaging be, he just can't do anything. It's not his fault. He just can't do anything. At a certain point, fine, I'm convinced. Democrats in power can't do anything. We have a lot that we want to do on the left.
Right.
So then how do you get that done? And we now know, because 2 years later, Republicans did the exact force the vote strategy and were able to get a number of concessions, that this strategy would have worked. There are these people who have mixed politics. Like, you can say a little bit of this thing that's been on your mind that you can't stand polite company on the left. And I'm grateful for never having been indoctrinated in the idea that the Democratic Party was some kind of like home or team sport for me that I had to defend despite the illogic of how they operated.
Welcome to Doomscroll. I'm your host, Joshua Citarella. My guest is Briahna Joy Gray, a lawyer and political consultant. In 2020, she served as the National Press Secretary for the Bernie Sanders campaign. She is the host of the Bad Faith podcast.
The idea that there was going to be an ability to take over the Democratic Party, to use traditional political means to reform the party, to pull it back to the left, was really undermined by what we saw and how the Bernie campaigns in 2016 and 2020 played out. And I'm not someone who I think jumped prematurely to these kinds of conclusions. It's part of why I sometimes become frustrated when people might want to write me off as a bad actor or someone who is, I don't know, as part of her grift is to have a pessimistic read of politics. To the contrary, I worked for the Bernie campaign in 2020. Right. I like to say I gave that man the best years of my 30s. And for what, right? Like, I was really committed to the project. I'm someone who only, left the law and entered into politics precisely because of how much I believed in the project in 2016 and because I felt compelled to start writing and begin a journalism career, precisely because of the media institutions, of journalists' unwillingness to engage substantively and accurately with what the movement and the spirit of the movement was all about. So I feel like I have given myself in many, many ways. I made some sacrifices in order to try that particular path. But I think I had an up-close view, and many other people had less proximate views of how the Democratic Party is willing to organize itself very effectively and efficiently to defeat a left insurgency in a way that it seems not to have the same appetite to actually defeat the right. And when you see over the course of years opportunities that were available to the small number of people who did get elected into Congress, who were progressives, who were the Justice Democrats candidates that did support Bernie Sanders and ostensibly espouse his values, the unwillingness to actually be adversarial with the Democratic Party demonstrated that the Democratic Party changes you. It's not the other way around. And the Biden administration in particular, seeing 4 years of what it meant to have, or at least 2 years of what it meant to have all of Congress and the White House, and to still have the messaging be, he just can't do anything. It's not his fault. He just can't do anything. At a certain point, fine, I'm convinced. Democrats in power can't do anything. We have a lot that we want to do on the left.
Right.
So then how do you get that done? And it simply doesn't seem to me that it's possible to do it by electing enough AOCs. Because we've seen in really recent history some pretty bad examples of how AOC is willing to bend the knee and completely undermine her own political project.
Did anyone blame you for Trump's victory because you voted for Jill Stein this time?
I mean, it's like white noise. People are always going to say that sort of thing. First of all, I live in D.C., so it's a laughable proposition that anybody I voted for mattered in any way.
Sure.
But I think particularly given the stakes of this election and the existence of a genocide happening in the background, I think really complicated the lesser of two evil arguments that were being made, at least within the left community. Of course, vote blue no matter who Democrats are going to say what they're going to say. There's that classic video of people leaving the DNC laughing and jeering and rolling their eyes at pro-Palestine activists and protesters. That was so disgusting and demoralizing to watch. But within the left community, whereas in 2020, I think I got a lot more pushback for voting green, or even in 2016, voting for Jill Stein in that election. This time around, I think most people on the left were so frustrated with the options available to them, felt like it was such a personally, ethically troubling situation for themselves to vote for Kamala Harris, that I didn't get as much of that, to be honest.
Right.
And I think the numbers show that a lot of folks, for whatever reason, ended up staying home because they were similarly demoralized by the options on the table.
This end of the left liberal alliance, as it's been called, it leaves you with rather few options. Generally speaking, what is the state of third parties?
It's tough. the duopoly is what it is, and
Right.
it's really difficult to surmount. My frustration, I think there's a way that if you acknowledge the reality that you're not going to be able to use the Democratic Party as a vehicle for real reform, then the follow-up that a lot of people offer is, well, we just got to stick with what we know doesn't work because there's no alternatives. The Green Party is insufficiently strong. PSL, Movement for People's Party, whatever else is out there in the ether, is even less likely than the Democratic Party to yield any dividends. And at least there's a real party here, and at least we can make some difference on the margins, and you can elect, an AOC or a Jamal Bowman who at least is going to say the right thing sometimes about some big ticket issue. And when a Republican is in office, are willing to say that Medicare for all matters again, and maybe that symbolically means something.
Right.
My feeling is that you have to start trying to build alternatives and not be so put off by the difficulty of it, or how you will in fact lose for a very long time while you're struggling to build something in the alternative, to not try in the first place. And there's this sort of ironic reality that I've observed on the left, where there's a real focus on saying, well, you're not going to be able to achieve successes through electoral politics. That's a sort of superficial, easy, low-hanging fruit way to engage in politics, which I think is completely fair.
Yeah.
And they say, well, in the alternative, you have to organize. It's going to take a long time. We have low labor density, for all the reasons that we know. But there's an appreciation of the fact that it's going to take time and it's going to take work to build up labor power. That same sort of willingness to not win instantly doesn't seem to attach to building third parties. And it's very confusing to me.
Right. Well, building the labor movement is a generational process at least, right? Like labor density has drifted down from like 30 to 11%. So we know how many decades it took to decline by about 20 points. So we could assume that it'll take at least that much time to rebuild it 20 points or something. But if you're trying to build a third party, it's a little bit of a weird proposal in that like you're going to vote to build institutional power for something that maybe your children will see if they're lucky. People seem not so receptive to that.
Well, look, one, I think it's less hard to organize a party than it is to organize an entire country with millions and millions of workers. I mean, that's just the reality of the situation. I'm not saying it's easy, but one of the dreams, for instance, of the Bernie movement was that he would take the enormous amount of not just attention and support that he got from voters, but dollars in terms of small dollar donations, out fundraising everybody else in that very, very crowded field in 2020, and say, I have demonstrated a capacity to raise millions of dollars without having to be beholden to these corporate interests.
Right.
And I'm going to use that power and the faith that all of these minimum wage workers put in me, giving them what amounts to an hour's salary, half a day's salary in these, a third of a day's salary in these $27 average donations, to commit to a real political project that is willing sincerely to be adversarial to the Democratic Party. But what we saw in contrast was a very quick and ready capitulation and bending the knee to Joe Biden. I will never forget being on quarantine in my studio apartment in DuPont Circle after the campaign, watching him on a Zoom call with Joe Biden, asking him just, please, sir, can we have a $15 minimum wage, like Oliver Twist style.
Yeah.
And Joe Biden, of course, committing, lying Biden style, that that would be a priority. And at very least, he was going to be bending the knee for something. Yeah. And we saw how that went. Immediately in the first months of the Biden administration, we saw the $15 minimum wage get stripped out of the must-pass COVID bill. We had Bernie Sanders trying to get it put back in the bill, but of course it took 60 votes to get it back in. There was a budget reconciliation bill, so it was must-pass and could pass with just 50 in the tie-breaking vote. And as a consequence, you had that whole pageantry where you had Kristen Sinema doing the thumbs down, and the narrative was, oh, well, Dems tried, but there were these outliers, there are these mansions of the world that preclude actual progress, without any interrogation of why it was that Chuck Schumer took the $15 minimum wage out of the bill in the first place and changed it from a 50+1 vote to a 60 vote kind of a question. And those are the kind of machinations that I think, again, over the course at least of the first 2 years of the Biden presidency, really confirmed for me that the Democratic Party was willing to fight Bernie Sanders and the left, and these, not even left, but basic centrist popular propositions like a $15 minimum wage tooth and nail.
A lot of directions I want to take this, but to stick to the third-party question for a moment here, do you have a preferred vehicle? Is the Green Party this assumed vehicle that you would choose to build on, People's Party? Like, which of these options is most appealing to you?
It seems to me that the party that has, it's not much, but the most and best infrastructure, the most longevity, and the ideals that best map onto, for the sake of argument, what I'll call like the Bernie-style project is the Green Party. If someone had an alternative and said, look, we have all this funding and we have all these people involved that have, all this experience to do this alternative, I would be open to that. When the Movement for the People's Party first launched, before all of the controversy that it ultimately got mired in, I was supportive. I'm a let many flowers bloom kind of gal.
Yeah. No, me too. Yeah.
But for like today, brass tacks, I would say the Green Party seems to be the best option in my view.
And I suppose at the scale you're talking about, the number of people that are going to influx to this thing are just going to disproportionately, whatever the existing values of this organization are, will be proportionally drowned out by the new membership.
Oh, what do you mean by that? The presumption is that
I think the Bernie-style project for social democracy in the United States is at odds with some of the environmentalist wings of the Green Party.
That's interesting. People say that. And, I've talked to Dr. Stein on my own show about this. There's this narrative line that goes, no one will join the Green Party because it sounds green and that sounds crunchy and it's a bunch of sort of white-haired Sierra Club ladies who want to save the wolves or something. And that's just not relatable. That's not like it's not a working class party.
Right.
And I hear people say that, but in my personal experience, the biggest obstacle is that no one knows that the Green Party exists, and that is a vehicle for social change. So if I'm sorry to be this, bourgeois socialist, but when I'm in the back of an Uber and I'm chatting, with the driver, and, I'm soft launching my political spiel, and they say, well, I don't want to vote for Kamala or Biden or Trump, and I'm disgruntled, and I'm not earning enough money, and my health care is expensive, and all of these things. I'm like, well, there's alternatives. And they say, who? And I said, well, I used to work for Bernie. Oh, I loved Bernie. They always loved Bernie. But Bernie's not running this time. And I say, well, there are third parties. There's other parties in America.
They literally don't know.
So I'm open to the idea that at some point there needs to be a branding shift on the Green Party. But it seems really premature when they're shut out of debates. They're shut out of any mainstream platform. The only time a New York Times or any mainstream paper is going to even acknowledge their existence is to do some hit piece about how, Jill Stein is an anti-vaxxer or whatever they want to say about someone in any given moment.
A few years ago, we didn't really talk about third parties because we had something called the DSA, which is not a political party, just an organization. But they were going to apply this pressure to the Democrats, run these strategic campaigns, and then slowly pull everybody to the left. It seems like the DSA has kind of not fulfilled a lot of its promises in the last 8 years. Do you have much hope for that organization specifically?
So I was a card-carrying member until, I could change credit cards and I forgot to, I just forgot. But I was a card-carrying member and
I didn't forget. I just chose to not renew it.
I felt it was important to stay a member and also join socialist alternatives and alternative and other sorts of organizations where possible. Because I don't like this sort of tendency to critique things in a team sport sort of way instead of trying to just make organizations better if you have the critique. That being said, my frustration is with defining oneself sort of outside of politics and certainly outside of being supporting independent parties. I think it was legitimate to want to try the strategy that was tried, the Justice Democrats strategy. I think it was legitimate to have tried, and I was hopeful for it as well. But I think it became apparent relatively early that it was like a tail wagging the dog situation with AOC and the squad members. That there was so much excitement about the idea that you kind of won by getting folks elected, that the left was somehow more serious because they had gotten these people into Congress and there were real live DSA Congress people in the mix, that there was an unwillingness to be critical of them when they strayed from the values of the organization. And there have been these little skirmishes over the years of the DSA saying they're going to sanction this person or that person for this or that vote. But I think there was a crisis of confidence and trust and what it even meant for them to be DSA candidates if they weren't going to be accountable to the organization. There was no accountability mechanism there. And when you think it's so good for your brand to have AOC that you're unwilling to say what you stand for separate and apart from her, well, then ultimately that's going to have a longer-term negative effect on the very brand that you were trying to protect in the first instance.
A little bit of a detour here, but I promise this will connect in a moment. You supported Force the Vote.
I did.
Alongside Jimmy Dore. You caught a lot of heat for that position.
I did.
Seems to be a recurring theme in the podcast. If you would recap for our listeners what Force the Vote was, in case they don't remember that,
Sure.
and what you hope to accomplish with that.
Sure. I love to point out that I first heard about Force the Vote watching Sam Cedar's show. And knowing about the acrimony between Sam Cedar and Jimmy Dore, when I heard Sam Cedar say that there was a good idea coming from Jimmy Dore, my little ears perked up.
Okay, I'm listening.
Said, yeah. How now, brown cow? And I went over and I heard the proposition, which was that because of the narrow margins in the House at the time, that the number of squad members exceeded the margin that Democrats basically needed all of the squad members to be on board for the Democrats to ever win anything in the House. That means that much like Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema, these people that we're told had the Biden administration in a vice grip, the progressives similarly could dictate the agenda of the Democratic Party, or at least hold it up so that nothing happens until there are some concessions that are made. And from my perspective, the real beauty of Force the Vote is that while frequently the argument is made that while the right can play hardball because they don't want good things to happen, they're happy if government doesn't work, they want government to be small, and Democrats want good things to happen, so they can't just be obstructionists. We need to play nice so we can get the ball going. The stakes of Force the Vote weren't some spending package and kids getting health care or anything of the like. It was simply Nancy Pelosi's ability to be Speaker of the House. That's it.
Right.
And we now know, because 2 years later, Republicans did the exact Force the Vote strategy and were able to get a number of concessions, that this strategy would have worked. At the time, however, while there were many people in support, not just Jimmy Dore, I think it's important to point out, Crystal Ball, Cornel West, Chris Hedges, a lot of people who were frankly held in very high esteem on the left, but whose voices I think were ignored because it was very convenient to say, this is a Jimmy Dore idea, he's a polarizing figure,
Right.
this is an excuse for me not to buy in.
Yeah.
There was what felt like a really sort of irrational rejection of it that was very personality driven. At the time, I wrote a piece for Current Affairs attempting to lay out the strategy separate and apart from Jimmy Dore. So, okay, fine, you hate his guts. I don't know what happened back in the TYT days. I'm newer on the scene than that. But here's how you can understand this without ever having to click on one of his videos, right?
Yeah.
And in response to that, people were saying a lot of misinformation. Some of the most visceral opponents of it were opposing it on the basis, for example, that Kevin McCarthy would become Speaker of the House if the progressives withheld their vote for Nancy Pelosi, which couldn't happen because you don't need, it's not a bare majority that you would need. You need over 50% of Congress. So unless Democrats voted affirmatively for a Republican speaker would not have defaulted into the position,
Sure.
even if they had gotten more votes than whatever alternative Democratic candidate were in the mix, if that makes sense.
Sure.
And
Sure.
again, we saw exactly this play out 2 years later with the Republicans. No matter how many times Kevin McCarthy wasn't Speaker, Hakeem Jeffries didn't magically become Speaker, right? That's not how it works. And there was historical precedent of this having happened 100 times back in the early part of the 20th century. This could have been a real opportunity for progressives to show that they do actually have power. We're not looking for some time 20 years in the future where we've gotten 50 more AOCs in Congress. Right now, today, you can demonstrate the value of fighting for more AOCs in Congress because even with 4 or 5 or 6 of them, they can have the Biden administration in a vice grip. And you can show Nancy Pelosi, this woman who's made your life hell, who made you cry on the floor over the Iron Dome vote, who whipped you all into shape, who you're cowering around calling Mama Bear because of God knows what she told you behind the scenes. You can demonstrate to her that you have a little bit of power on your own. And they chose not to do that for various reasons. I think a lot of it was interpersonal. And it was clear, I think, to a lot of us that it was a kind of a once in a, I don't want to say generational opportunity, but it was certainly once in a term style of opportunity.
Yeah. I think this gets at a contradiction that we have in today's left maybe it's been there for much longer, but people will say that we need this overwhelming majority to accomplish our goals. And they'll also say that I refuse to share a table with anyone who doesn't share my exact specific beliefs. And there are elements of Jimmy Dore's audience that are ugly, or not people that I may personally want to hang out with. He has a lot of conservative audience, a lot of people with crank ideas, but this seemed like a moment to, scalpel approach, really exert some power in an effective way. But people were, I think, culturally afraid. They didn't want to become contaminated by being in a coalition with people that they disagreed with.
It feels very silly to me. You have an entire Democratic Party that in the last election went full bore, we're going to do a genocide and we're going to do right-wing immigration.
Right.
I mean, they fully did fuck them kids in cages. Like they just decided they didn't care anymore.
Yeah.
And everyone went along with it. Half the left went along with it. Oh, Kamala's working tirelessly for a ceasefire. And you're telling me that one rather bombastic podcaster on YouTube is enough to dissuade you from even listening to an idea? Fine, you don't like Jimmy Dore. Do you not have respect for Chris Hedges all of a sudden? Do you not have respect for Cornel West all of a sudden? Crystal Ball is as close as we've got to like a straight shooting professional news personality on the left. You couldn't hear it from her mouth?
Yeah.
What am I, chopped liver? I mean, really, there were no shortage of alternative voices. Kyle Kalinske, no shortage of alternative voices who you could have listened to if you wanted to. And moreover, Katie Halper, we had live streams with all of these voices coming through, along with people who had personally suffered from the vagaries of our healthcare system, giving testimonials about their children or their parents who have lost their lives because of premium lapses and the like. We were doing cold calls over Thanksgiving and Christmas leading up to the Force the Vote deadline in January, doing Slack trees to call Congress members to try to organize them to pay attention to what we were doing. Medicare for All rallies were organized in the beginning of the following year, which Jimmy Dore offered a lot of support for organizationally and I believe financially to try to get people out and capitalize on this moment where, remember, this was during the pandemic. This was before vaccines. And this was when people were very scared and dying at very high numbers. 15 million people had just lost their health insurance because we have an employer-based health insurance system and people were being laid off. There were shutdowns. And at this moment, when healthcare should have been front of mind, when Bernie lost for the second time and we knew Joe Biden basically ran and campaigned on, even if Medicare for All somehow passed the House and the Senate, I would veto it. There was an unwillingness to try to use this moment to push it back into the foreground. Because of Jimmy Dore? There used to be columns, right? And if you were progressive and lefty or liberal or whatever, then there was a certain kind of style that you liked. You were into health, you were into technology. All of these things were like liberal coded. And they were very sort of like bourgeois and sophisticated and elite. And all of that came in a package. And then it was like all of these beer drinking, cowboy hat wearing, unsophisticated yokels. This is the Bush era. Like this is what I was used to growing up. But there's a realignment that has happened, that is happening, I think, where suddenly you have a Kennedy from Hollywood who is into health and wellness, but also kind of rugged and has that car that smells like dogs and, has a little bit of this Camelot mystique, but also is willing to go there with some of these social issues that maybe have jumped the shark a little bit. There are a lot of people who are panicking about, can my adult white son get into college these days with all this competitiveness, and the pie is getting smaller, and can you really achieve, and what's going to happen if my baby boy doesn't get into Brown with all of these immigrants coming over, or these hardworking Chinese American kids. And this panic is not, isn't a real opportunity for it to spill out in culturally sanctioned ways on the left. It's not polite to talk about those kinds of things.
Right.
We care about racial equity. We can't talk about what is fundamentally a panic about late capitalist scarcity, but that is a conversation that's not allowed to happen. So it becomes these whispered conversations about, well, the world is changing too fast. I'm losing the grip on the opportunities I used to have. And is it because of this minority, or is it because of this trans kid, or is it because of whatever? And RFK Jr. and Jimmy Dore's audience, and I don't want to make it about Jimmy Dore, but people are looking for outlets for that. And you see it, I think, in a lot of these bro podcasts as well. There are these people who have mixed politics. You know, Theo Von, he's funny.
Yeah.
And he's saying things that feel like it's like a release valve. Like you can say a little bit of this thing that's been on your mind that you can't stand polite company on the left. And he doesn't seem like really hateful or anything. You can just kind of have a chuckle and laugh and have an open conversation. Joe Rogan.
Yeah.
You know, we can just chat for 3 hours and not have to be so precise about what we say. And, you know.
I seem to remember a certain candidate he might have supported a few years back also. Yeah.
Right.
Huh.
Right. I think that's the problem. There's just not an outlet for that. And that's not to say that I, you know, personally validate or affirm every one of the beliefs that comes out of these spaces. But I think you have to be attendant to and not just try to ignore and press down the reality that people are seeking out. Jamie Dore didn't just snap his fingers and create these people.
Yeah.
There are folks that are looking for a realigned sort of politics and to find all of that cluster of news and that cluster of approach to life in one spot.
That's why I keep digging on this issue, because I'm interested in this particular cohort you're describing and what the coalition that makes up this third party might be. How do you see these different groups coming together?
The PNC libs are in the Democratic Party,
right.
And that's where they're going to stay. The question is what happens to the Bernie coalition was never that.
No.
What is going to happen to them? If the options are Kamala Harris, who's lived up the wazoo, and they're already, sorry, I mean, they're already talking about her for 2028. There's, you know, Jonathan Chait are doing like, I'm not a corn cob, I'm not a corn cob. Like I was right the whole time. Actually, it was Tim Walz's fault for being too left. I mean, the cope that's happening.
If they do that, they deserve it. On these topics of political realignment and coalitions, what is the role of alternative media in this space?
So I don't think people should vote for Trump. And the reason is that to the extent that...
As an accelerationist.
As an accelerationist, yeah. To the extent that there is a media battle that's going to ensue, and you have to make the case for why Harris's loss should force folks to move left and embrace more left politics, voting for Donald Trump is not that. They're going to make the argument that Donald Trump is popular, we've got to rally around Donald Trump, the Democratic Party has to be more like Donald Trump to get those voters back. I mean, that's the ratchet effect that we've been seeing. Yeah. To me, the value of third parties is to create a landing pad. You need to create a political alternative that you can point to that says, if you wanted these votes, these are the politics you have to adopt. And staying at home creates too much of a void, right? Like people who just don't vote at all, they can be weaponized. Jonathan Chait can make whatever claim he wants to make that is convenient to him about what could have gotten them to the polls. Oh, it was sexism or racism with Kamala Harris. You know, they can make those arguments unless you have them voting, say, hypothetically, for Jill Stein, and then at very least you can't say that it was a sexism argument, right? Like there's a there.
Right.
I also think there's some practical realities to it, getting to 5% of the vote, getting federal matching funds, getting automatic ballot access. So much of what...
Just for the listeners, what happens at 5%?
So you get federal matching funds. The Green Party has almost no money, and they spend most of their money trying to get ballot access. States are constantly ratcheting up the hoops that you have to jump through in order just to be able to be on the ballot. And the Democratic Party spends millions and millions of dollars ensuring that they won't be.
Right.
So to the extent that they can even fundraise at all, if you want to send your $7 to Jill Stein, it's like in one door, out the other, because all they can really do with it. They're not doing ads. They're not hiring up staff. They have no money. The idea that it's a grift to work for the Green Party is laughable. Jill Stein doesn't take a salary for running. Everyone on the campaign, as I understood it, earned the same modest, very modest salary. And it's all they can do just to keep the wheels on the car. Mm-hmm. So if they could at very least not to have to fight those ballot access battles and additionally get a little bit of a boost in federal matching funds, it would be meaningful for the party. I'm not saying then tomorrow we have a Green Party president, but it's a meaningful building toward what we need to happen.
I mean, if you asked me a few years ago, I felt like I had a certain strategy for this. Part of my job is to like show the optimism or the light at the end of the tunnel, imagine the alternative, all these things. But I think right now in this particular period, I just feel less confident than I have in the last few years. So I was very opposed to a third party a few years ago. I'm open to a lot more things than I was before. I just think, I mean, it was a catastrophic failure. This is like, it's so bad that they can't even win the popular vote, you know? They're losing margins with every demographic, all the people that they claim to represent, like young people, people of color, working people. Like there's just, I wrote a piece about this recently that the Democrats and Republicans represent different aspects of the ruling class. Labor's interests are just completely de-aligned from political representation. The most comfortable that I feel is telling people to read Damage magazine. That's the extent of, I don't have a political prescription right now, but there's some good articles in that magazine. That's about as confident as I feel right now. But I am also somewhat of a student of neoliberalism. 1980s we think of as this big moment in which they just came out of nowhere and took power, remade the world, remade political common sense. If you trace that back, 1947, the meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society in Switzerland, like there's this gathering of intellectuals. There's 30 years of lobbying institutions. It even goes further back than that to the 1930s. And that's when a lot of these ideas were first formulated, theorized, and so on. So if you're pursuing politics with, let's say, a 50-year time horizon, things become pretty different, you know, and maybe it's 5% of the vote, you know, in 4 years from now. Maybe it's 10% in 8 years or something like that. That's a little optimistic. But approaching these things as an intergenerational political project is maybe a wise way to consider some of these issues now.
Take the RFK Jr. example. I wouldn't have thought that he would necessarily, no, obviously his poll share dropped off significantly. And I think there were reasons for that, including his commitment to the Zionist project.
Right.
I think a lot of his base, we're talking about who these people are who are looking for an alternative. They were either sort of America First protectionists or people with actual moral commitments to not wanting to pursue a genocide, who saw the obvious inconsistency between his position on Ukraine and his position on Israel. And I think a lot of the enthusiasm fell off. Dennis Kucinich, who I admire as a Cleveland girly, you know, left his campaign. And I don't think he's ever expressly said it was because of that particular issue, but I can't imagine that didn't create tensions there.
Sure.
But all that being said, there was a moment in time where RFK Jr. came out of left field and was polling at 20%. If he can do it, and it's some combination of name recognition, having a lot of money, picking a VP who herself is a billionaire and can fund your Super Bowl campaign, all of those things being said, what that says to me, that if you have a famous political celebrity and a billionaire backer, this is not what I would prescribe for the left for obvious reasons, but there is a world where that sort of thing at least can get you on the map.
Yeah, yeah.
And having certain kind of politics and being willing to talk about certain kind of third rail issues, some of which I think are good to talk about, some of which aren't my politics, but hey, can get you the kind of notice that gets you in the playing field. So while I agree that historically these things have had a long time horizon, et cetera, I also wouldn't take off the table different kinds of strategies that have shown some glimmers of successes in the shorter term. What would it have looked like if Bernie had done a dirty break? What would it have looked like if at the end of 2020, Bernie Sanders says, look, I appreciate the commitment of this political revolution. We've got 30% of the Democratic Party that's still behind me. You deserve better than Joe Biden. We're in the middle of a pandemic and this man is talking about nothing.
Yeah.
You deserve more. And if this is what your politics are, we're going to build something together. This isn't over. This is a long-term political project. And when you trusted me with half a day's salary, I'm going to put it to good use and not just funnel it back into the Democratic Party. What would that have looked like?
It certainly couldn't be worse than it is right now.
Certainly could not.
Yeah. Did you catch this flip with RFK also, that when he was really polling well, he was doing this big podcast circuit, right? He was making these quantitatively really big appearances, huge numbers on these podcasts. And people said, like, yeah, he's not going to stand a chance because he's only doing alt media. He's not getting really the important visibility. And then once Trump got elected and did that like bro populism podcast circuit, people are like, it's the podcast. That's how they're reaching people. This is so important. And the exact same people who said RFK is not significant because he's reaching people through alt media. Complete narrative flip on these guys.
Yeah, I mean, I think you lose enough and eventually you have to come to terms with it. Like eventually you have to save face or something. I think the fact is that alternative media is where people are getting their media consumption. No one's turning on CNN unless you're in a dentist's office or an airport Certainly nobody in our generational cohort or younger.
They seem to be selling MSNBC for parts right now.
And who can blame them?
Good riddance.
I mean, the observation is, many people, meme accounts, hippo accounts, and all of the funny people on Twitter predicted that as soon as Inauguration Day rolled around, you were going to get a bunch of mea culpas and Chris Hayes talking about how terrible things are in Palestine, and suddenly you have permission to do it. And that kind of lack of confidence, the willingness to talk about the true thing only when it doesn't matter anymore, whether it's about Gaza or it's about some of these COVID policy concerns, created a crisis of confidence in traditional media. And people see the revolving door of the former Biden administration talking heads that go and then get your TV show where you never say anything negative about Biden, and you spent 2 years acting like the man wasn't senile when we all could see with our eyes what was happening. And what do you expect from people? Not to mention that it's dry and it's boring. And if I wanted to watch a never Trump Republican blather on sitting next to a lib, why am I watching Michael Steele on MSNBC? Why am I watching Bush's comms woman have a primetime show on what is ostensibly the liberal left representative channel? Nobody wants this. And their politics don't represent anybody. It is this PMC, it is this decorum and politeness vibe of politics that doesn't actually attach to anybody's political ideology. It is the PMC world. And that's what people are rejecting. That's why I'm not concerned about what's going to happen to the PMCs. Is the alternative media structure going to be too PMC based? No, the PMCs aren't thriving in alternative media.
It is a class in decline. Yeah, that's important to remember.
Moreover, I think I've had a little bit of I adore Catherine Liu. We've had this debate a little bit on my show and elsewhere. I think her analysis is spot on and so important. I would add to it, however, that this thing is happening where they're like PMCs are going extinct because fewer and fewer people have resources. I was talking to a friend recently. I formerly was a lawyer. I have a lot of friends who are lawyers, many of whom were public interest lawyers, who are in a panic because they don't know if their 10-year public interest loan forgiveness, which is all for my age cohort coming to fruition, if they're actually going to have their loans forgiven. And hell hath no fury, like a lawyer scorned, who now suddenly is being told that they got to pay this debt that's been accruing interest for the last 10 years of their life. All of the treats that were historically given to PMCs to make them feel like they had a legitimate bargain in the social contract, that they were better, even if they were an adjunct professor making $50,000 a year, that at least they had their little knit J. Crew tie and, they knew how to make reservations at wherever.
Right.
And they hung their PhD on the wall. Like those benefits are running out. The same way on the other side in conservatives, the wages of whiteness in that analysis, people are feeling like it's not enough. There's a longevity crisis. People aren't living as long as their parents. Some astronomical percentage of people under the age of 30 are still living at home. Nobody in my generational cohort is meeting their cultural milestones. We're having no kids are being born, and the white supremacists on Twitter are losing their minds about it.
Yeah.
And there's no one that's offering a real prescription of how to solve any of these kinds of problems.
I followed your work for a long time. I'm curious about how you got politicized and some of your background in this field, because I hear you talk about events that are in the news cycle, but where does the story start for you?
I was just talking about this again with some of my friends, and how different it felt when we were in college. The political space felt very different. There was this broad, Bush is bad, Jon Stewart is good kind of vibe, but it was very binary. Like that was it. Bush is bad and dumb. Jon Stewart is good and funny and wholesome. War is bad.
Being anti-war.
Right.
Yeah.
And then I graduated college in 2007 and started law school like a week before Lehman went under, which I remember because my boyfriend at the time worked for Lehman, and my college boyfriend. And it suddenly felt like a very different sort of a world where the stakes were sort of different, and the expectations that we had as very privileged recent graduates from elite institutions were suddenly the things that we were promised were not assured to us. And I think it forced a more substantive reckoning. And this is obviously a very niche, this is, a very narrow cohort that I'm talking about here. A different kind of reckoning. I was talking to a friend from law school last night, and we were sort of joking about how at no point in our undergrad or legal education was there a serious conversation about the ethics of the kinds of jobs that were dangled out in front of us as what the smart people got and what you should be doing. We were talking about how much everyone wanted to work for Facebook, how much everybody wanted to work for one of these tech companies, and how it was perceived as virtuous and good. And after jumping through all these hurdles and doing all the standardized tests and, excelling in debate club and doing all of the things, the next ring that you were supposed to be reaching for after graduation was to work for a tech company or to work for McKinsey.
These things, well, maybe not McKinsey, but the tech platforms at the time, just for, Zoomers who watch the show who don't have the historical memory of this, this was not yet a right-wing coded thing or disinformation or fact checkers or whatever. That we'll definitely talk about some of that later. But the idea at that time was that social media was going to give everyone a voice and that it was a liberatory project, right? That you were going to kind of unleash this democratic energy. And we saw that in the Arab Spring and Occupy Wall Street and this kind of disorganized, leaderless mass protest that, surprise, surprise, was a catastrophic failure precisely because it was leaderless and disorganized. But there was a very kind of progressive excitement about working for social media companies specifically.
Yes. And I wish there had been more engagement politically with what it meant to go work for me. I'm telling you, the ethics of McKinsey, it's embarrassing to admit, almost never came up. I will say that in my own household, there was, I think, some more pushback.
Yeah.
My mother is someone who was raised by a kind of a radical Nation of Islam father who had very anti-establishment politics, to say the least.
You can say the most also. We have a long time for the podcast.
I mean, I'll leave it to her to do the biography of old Ronald X. But, she talks about having been sort of indoctrinated in a certain kind of Black liberatory politics prior to going to college at Howard and knowing everything and having read everything because of her father before she ever got to campus. Playing Gil Scott-Heron records, the white man has a God complex. I mean, that's how she was raised. And she talks about how, she thought he was being a bit much, as a teenager, relaxed dad. But I think life validated his politics in certain sorts of ways, particularly his skepticism in the Democratic Party and traditional politics. And growing up, it wasn't so front of mind. It wasn't so constantly articulated in the household. But my mother said, she's someone who never voted for a Democrat except until Obama, voted Green, voted third party, with the exception of Barack Obama, which we all now feel some sort of way about.
Right.
And I think there was a real openness to political alternatives. And I'm grateful for never having been indoctrinated in the idea that the Democratic Party was some kind of home or team sport for me that I had to defend despite the illogic of how they operated. I remember her saying, we moved abroad when I was 8. Basically, the entire Clinton terms, we lived overseas. And she expressed frustration about what that political moment felt like. She says that when Clinton won, it felt sort of like when Biden won, that it was an indictment of a more kind of progressive politics, that neoliberalism won out.
Oh, wow.
And that there wasn't space to ask for more, to want more, to demand more, and that it was a very demoralizing moment for people with more progressive politics. And in terms of my own personal political journey and being able to put words to who I am and what I believe in, I think I had an experience that many people had when Bernie came along, which is that he started saying things matter-of-factly and in a context that was professional and sort of socially validated and politically validated about what we deserved as a society that normally is relegated to the fringes of some kook on the corner or some Green Party weirdo or what have you. And when he came along and used this very moral language about how healthcare is a human right, and how it is not a personal failure for you to be struggling in the way that so many people are struggling, I think there was like a light switch. I think that psychically, the entire country has been carrying around the idea that their increasingly degrading quality of life is because of their own personal merit. They didn't work hard enough, they didn't bootstrap enough, that they weren't smart enough. And when someone came along and said, no, there's a systemic problem here, actually, and that we have the richest country in the history of the world, and you're getting so much less than people elsewhere because of policy choices that are being made by both of these parties that I'm willing to criticize, both of them at the same time. That was a kind of a light switch that went off in a genie that you can't quite put back in the bottle. And everybody who was released from that sort of, self-flagellation that they were experiencing before Bernie came along is now like, what do I do next? Do I go support RFK Jr.? Do I go listen to Joe Rogan? Do I stay at home? But they know damn well that the answer isn't Kamala Harris in the Democratic Party.
I mean, the only thing that I would add to it is that we also see that on the right, and Trump around the same time started saying some similar things, populist economics and so on. It's very interesting about your mother because a lot of people, I think, are just plainly unaware of Clinton's legacy. Like, I think of him as like completing Reagan's project in the way that he slashed welfare, and people think of him as this like champion of progressive values, and he's doing all this budget cutting and belt tightening. Like, I don't know why that legacy is so prominent now.
No, I like to say it takes a Democrat. It takes a Democrat to cut welfare. It takes a Democrat to really do the thing.
Yeah.
Because there's no opposition when it's a Democrat.
What about your own political education? Like, were there specific writers, theorists, thinkers, like what inspired you to change some of your ideas? Obviously, aside from just history and the lived reality of 2008.
So for me, I might be the only person on earth for whom Harvard Law School was a radicalizing experience to the left. And I think it was precisely because it is such a corporate indoctrination machine that if you have any sense of your own independent values, kind of a human rights framework, you butt up against it in the context of the law. What is the law? It's all about values and concretizing those values prescriptively with rules, right? And you can pretend that it's not about that, but that's what it is. It's not.
Is it about that, or is it about private property?
I mean, that's the value. That's the problem.
That is the
value.
I thought you were talking about humanist values or something.
It's not those humanist values, right? And it becomes very clear. So for me, one of the most radicalizing moments was I had this professor named John Hanson, who I talk about ad nauseum. People who listen to my show know this. But I had him for torts 1L year, and then I later took him for corporate law. And he kind of goes under the radar as a sort of Marxist economist, but like no one was using those words to talk about him.
No kidding.
And I remember him asking us, like presenting a very like famous case pattern to us, and asking us what we thought should happen. Like we read it, we see what the court said, but given the vulnerabilities at play, a young girl, an immigrant without a parent who is asked to take a vaccine and has a negative and adverse reaction.
Right.
And the court says, well, you were warned. There were signs posted. And she's like, I'm 7 and I don't speak English. And, asking us questions about if you were to design a system that was endeavoring to minimize the harms, not just like litigate who should pay, but a priori, like how will we design this if the goal was to make sure that girl didn't get hurt in the first place? What kind of incentive structures, who would you make responsible for the negative outcome? The little girl or the people who are posting the signs, who maybe should make sure there's a guardian, maybe should give require some kind of oral consent? Like, how would you structure the system?
Yeah.
I remember him asking us, who are the most vulnerable quantities in society? And this is in a corporate law class, I think, who the law should be designed to protect ostensibly. Like, who's vulnerable? Just raise your hands. Like, what's vulnerable? Children, people with, intellectual deficits, animals, the environment, the poor.
Sure.
It's not rocket science. And then you start to learn about what corporate law says is the most vulnerable constituency that requires protection. Shareholders. And most corporate law classes don't have the preamble. They just say, the purpose of corporate law is to protect shareholder value. This is what it is moving forward. Like, that's just the indoctrination that you get. And when you have a professor that's willing to suggest that we actually have power to change how the system is and design the system, and that the people who've been designing it forever are, in fact, the shareholders, and that's why we have these priorities written into the law. And when you're going through class after class after class, property law, criminal law, and you're seeing these same patterns emerge, it becomes a deeply radicalizing experience. And then you realize you're at an institution with people who are fully going to be on the Supreme Court and are fully clerking for the Supreme Court and are fully going to be senators and are Vivek Ramaswamy was in my class.
Really?
You know?
Did he pay attention?
I didn't personally know him. I have friends who knew him, but, you know, I didn't personally know him. But, like, you have this sense that the people who are articulating these sometimes asinine beliefs and values in your classes are going to go somewhere and make them law.
You know, this is very weird because I had lunch with someone this week who also went to school with Vivek Ramaswamy and told me this story that his favorite place to get pizza in New York City is in Times Square. And it's like, that is just, of all the other political opinions you have, that is the most deranged thing I've ever heard.
Tracks. The kind of guy who, like, fundamentally misunderstands Saved by the Bell and the way that he did. Like, of course he's going to want to go to Times Square for pizza. Also, about that whole H-1B visa fiasco, I do like the people who pointed out, for people who somehow missed this, I guess a little bit of
I'm just on the edge of my seat with popcorn for this one, yeah.
So obviously, you know, he angered the right by suggesting that there are cultural deficits among white American programmers that make them less competitive to predominantly Indian H-1B visa.
They didn't learn violin and so on.
Exactly. Yeah. And that if American kids watched less Saved by the Bell and did more like mathlete competitions or something on the weekend, then they would be able to compete. And he specifically said that we have too many people wanting to be Zach and not enough people wanting to be Screech.
Right.
And folks pointed out, well, if you watch the show, Zach was smart. Like, Zach was very smart. He got better SAT scores. Screech was not actually the brainiac on the show. He was just a nerd. Also, I like to point out that the white conservatives who were being victimized by this cultural deficit narrative that is so often applied to Blacks and brown people in the United States of America to justify our own economic non-competitiveness. It was kind of cathartic to watch, I have to confess. But also, fun fact, Zach is a man of mixed white and Asian descent, and this part of the conversation is not happening at all. The actor, his mom, I think, is from the Philippines.
Wasian.
Or Indonesian, I think.
Wasian, they call it. Yeah. That's
Hapa, yeah. If you're asking me what attracts me to my politics, it is fundamentally the underlying morality. And I think this is something. I think this is something that's interesting when I talk to, say, libertarians. You know, until recently, I co-hosted a show with the Libertarian, at Rising with Robbie.
I've got a few questions about that. Yeah.
and we had these kind of debates. You know, I interpersonally, I like Robbie, and you know, the cameras would cut, and sometimes he'd be like, "My guy, like, it can't be that a kind of a libertarian value system, devoid of any kind of ethical precepts, is satisfying to you." Yeah. And it is. I mean, he's a libertarian. It is satisfying to him. But sometimes you'll find yourself in an argument with a conservative, and or a libertarian, and you'll be confronted with this idea that, like, there's like a ideological investment in small government, for instance. And I'll sit here and I'll tell you, like, if you magically showed me the way that we can have a one-person government and everyone's thriving, I don't give a damn. Like, sure. I'm not ideologically committed to how many people are sitting in buildings on Capitol Hill. Like, I don't care.
Okay.
But that emerges all the time because there's a fundamental prioritization that is not moral on the other side of the aisle. And I don't mean to paint with a broad brush. There are conservatives that have obviously various moral beliefs that drive them to, oppose abortion or be isolationist or all kinds of things, some of which I agree with and some of which I don't. Folks who I would say have an establishment orientation, whether they're conservative Republicans or liberals. The reason why they're not on the left, despite, I think everyone sits here and says, oh yes, I don't want little girls to be hurt. Yeah, I don't want the air to have pollution in it. Yeah, I don't want to run out of all of our natural resources. Like, people on a vibes-based level agree that sort of...
Sure.
But what you get is, well, yeah, but that's not the way the world works. There have to be consequences. Hillary Clinton says, what do you want, ponies? When Bernie Sanders starts talking about healthcare, what do you want, a cookie? You know, when he starts talking about healthcare, a fantastical reality that exists in every other similarly situated country in the world. And you have to convince them. This is my, like, Giannis Varoufakis Star Trek Utopia point. Like,
sure.
You have to model for people. You have to convince them, because it's like it's like the, what do you call it, the just world hypothesis. This is another thing that I got from that law professor. We are uncomfortable with inequity. We don't like walking past homeless people. We don't like seeing people who have less than us. We don't like turning on the TV and the Oxfam commercial and the child with flies on their face. We don't like it. We're uncomfortable with it. But we have cognitive crutches that help us manage that dissonance. We tell ourselves that people to whom bad things happen must not have been working hard, or they deserve it in some ways. And when good things befall us, we say it's because we're exceptional in these ways. And the things change, the kind of like theory of change argument is that when the gap between the world as it is and the world as it should be becomes so huge that we can no longer rationalize why we have what we have and others don't, or why we're struggling and others have so much. And as a media actor, I think that part of my responsibility is heightening those contradictions so we get people out of their apathy and get to a point where they feel like they cannot enjoy what they have. I mean, sorry, be a downer, but you cannot enjoy, you cannot persist under the status quo.
Let's discuss, you mentioned your dear libertarian friend. I used to get my news from you from, let's say, like September of 2022 up until, I believe, June 7th of 2024. Did something happen there where you left the show abruptly? Like, seems very curious.
The Hill never actually said why they weren't having me back. I think the email that I got, I posted on Twitter, and it was very minimal. My name was spelled wrong. Thanks, champs. And it seemed obvious, though, to me that it was because of my coverage of Gaza. There had been a lot of internal pressure over it for, you know, the eight months or so since October 7th, but especially ramping up for probably the 6 months before the end, when there was a complete overhaul in the kind of the show staff.
Right.
A new producer, an exodus of a lot of the old guard, and some others who were fired. So that basically, between January and when I was fired, there was nobody who had been working on the show the previous year except for Robbie.
Oh, wow.
And, like, my makeup artist.
Yeah.
I miss you, Diana. So, it was very clear that there was internal pressure for Robbie to balance out my takes. As a libertarian, a lot of libertarians are not pro-war in Gaza.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, there was pressure to provide a counterbalance. And I think that put pressure on Robbie, who didn't necessarily want to even be having the conversation at all, who would rather have not talked about it at all, to provide a rather indefensible pushback to straight reporting. So let me be more specific in terms of what the pressure looked like. For one, we were told that our radars, which are our direct camera essays, we had complete editorial control over. When there started to be pushback on what we did in segments, and I was told we can do like one Gaza block a day, we did about 8 to 10 blocks. You know, there were like 10 stories you could do about Gaza. And all of the Gaza stories were very well performing as well. So I would have my hobby horses that I would want to talk about from time to time that didn't perform well, and I had to kind of take it on the chin. Okay, we can only talk about this, labor organizing story so many times.
It's a numbers game.
It's a numbers
and,
game.
The ad revenue is like really, that's what pays the bills. So
That's what, I get that.
segments that pay well is kind of important. It's interesting that they wouldn't want to do that.
But Gaza was different, right? Gaza was one that I cared about and also performed well. And I was being told we had to basically get everything in one block. So consequently, I had negotiated out of doing as many radars. I started doing them again because I could have editorial control and talk about Gaza and get as many stories in my radar as I wanted to.
So you could do kind of 2 segments instead of just one.
Exactly.
Yeah.
At that point, there started to be editorial pressure on my radars, right? And so tensions were heightening. There was also this push to get guests that were pro-Israel guests, which is fine with me. I mean, I understand
searching under the couch cushions for these people?
Yeah, but the problem is, who are these people, right? So the pro-Palestine guest would be a historian, a journalist, people with credibility and insight and knowledge. The pro-Israel guest would be some guy who posts a lot about Israel from Israel, who would just get on and basically call me an anti-Semite and a Hamas lover and not offer anything substantive, and then use the clips to try to mount a month-long hate campaign on Twitter to just kind of exhaust me. And so it was very frustrating, but I always said yes to those guests because I was trying to maintain the peace. And as long as I got to talk about what I wanted to talk about, I was willing to take my licks. Eventually, one of these guests was a sister of a hostage who volunteered herself for the show, which I thought was a first red flag, editorially, journalistically. And her, I don't want to mischaracterize her. I don't have the email in front of me. But she specifically said she wanted to come on to debate me, basically, to talk to me.
Right.
Which was clearly a red flag.
And she reached out to the producers.
Exactly. And the producer, who I asked, does this seem legitimate to you? Is there no other guests you can find? Can you find a Zionist historian, literally anybody who I can ask a question that has some editorial value? But no, she volunteered herself. She came on and very predictably made it personal about me. Okay, I was very happy to talk to her as a human being who misses her sister, about what her sister was like and how horrible it's been for her to miss her as she's been held hostage and what she knows about her health and yada, yada, yada. But at a certain point, she kept politicizing it, right? She kept saying, well, it's shameful, Briahna, that you don't care about the hostages. All right, well, if you're going to bring up the political question, how do you feel about these protests that have been happening in Israel where hostage family victims are very frustrated that Netanyahu isn't prioritizing hostage release? Well, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about politics. Okay, well, tell me about your sister. What was her favorite food? What did she love to do? I'm happy to talk about that. But eventually it got personalized, and I was feeling very frustrated with our producer, who doesn't step in, who very predictably knew this was going to happen. And at the end of the interview, when she calls me a rape apologist or whatever it was, I don't remember, and I roll my eyes, that was my frustration with the situation being exactly what everybody could have predicted it was, and that I was working at an institution that not only wasn't protecting me, was setting me up, frankly.
Right.
It had done so more than once. At the same time, there was all this pressure behind the scenes to basically not talk about Gaza at all. And then I got an email the next day saying that my services were no longer needed.
Probably was not too surprising because there was an incident of this before.
Yes.
With Katie Halper.
Yes.
And I imagine you must have known that to some degree going into the job.
Yeah. So I was at Rising when Katie was, no longer wanted to work with you, however they characterize it. So what was interesting is we were always looking for new hosts. And Katie was being sort of auditioned to be a Friday host. I wanted to work a fewer, less days a week. People go on vacation. You need a deeper roster. And so we were really excited about that. There was also discussion of developing her own show on the program. And what happened with her is that she wrote a radar. It was factual, but the objection was apparently that she had described Israel as an apartheid state, something that is, frankly, not that controversial these days because we've pushed the Overton window with October 7th. Right. But editorial had a problem. Higher-ups at the Hill had a problem. And they pulled it. She offered to talk about it and rewrite it a little bit as I understand, but they were like, no. And also, we never want to work with you again.
Wow.
I would not trust The Hill from an editorial perspective. They are fundamentally committed to a pro-Zionist approach to covering this particular issue.
Right.
And to the extent that there are people who are able to get alternative perspectives on the show, know that they're doing it beleaguered every step of the way.
So a media organization like The Hill, there are certain people who are in place that can gatekeep resources, editorial control, things like this. When you're on your own platform, you upload directly onto, I don't know where you do it, YouTube and whatever RSS feed and so on. No one can get in between you and the stuff that you publish. Did anyone try to come after your podcast after that?
Oh, yeah. There was like a spam. I got like hundreds of emails to Patreon. I think they mistakenly emailed me, like my Patreon email address, instead of like Patreon the business. I'm not saying these are the brightest bulbs in the shed. With a form letter that was from a bunch of different like bot name accounts. Like it looked like it was coming from, but it was the same content that basically said Briahna's an anti-Semite and you should deplatform her from Patreon.
Right.
One of these days, that sort of thing might work. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
There was a whole, 2 years ago, there was this whole cycle of people trying to get people kicked off of Substack because of their politics.
Yes. Yeah.
There was the story about, I'm no big fan of his politics, but Kanye West being debanked, and what does that mean for someone because of ideological commitments that you don't agree with, not being able to have a relationship with a financial institution? The Canadian trucker fiasco and some of those payment programs that they weren't being allowed to use in that context. Right. There was the RICO case against the Cop City folks for starting a GoFundMe to get people out of jail whose First Amendment rights had been infringed upon, but they're going after them under RICO charges for a GoFundMe. There are all of these pressure points. There are all of these examples of folks trying to use social media choke points to preclude people from being able to earn a livelihood and to speak. And I think it's very dangerous. And I think it's probably a matter of time before they are more successful than they happen to be in the instance of me.
What do you think about this issue of Meta getting rid of fact checkers? Because you've been one of the people on the left who's kind of led the charge, I would say, in this question of free speech. You've devoted a lot of time in reporting to it. And that seems to be a rather uncomfortable position for some people, particularly in reference to certain people who are platformed on Substack, things they might say, regrettable, ugly things on social media, so on.
Look, so the way that this has been framed as a partisan issue is really interesting. Honestly, Robbie has kind of a good take on this, which is that there has been, in the sort of Elon Musk era of Twitter, a lot of focus with the Twitter files, et cetera, on the fact-checking itself and the sort of partisan leaning of it, when the focus should be on why it is that whatever government institution is putting all this pressure on these independent media organizations to moderate content in the way that the administration ideologically wants it to. So is it that you're really that mad at Facebook or Twitter, whoever happens to be in charge, or should the pressure point be, why is our government using its three-letter agencies to try to suppress or boost certain kinds of content on the social media platforms? The historical problem is going to be that without transparency as to how the fact-checking is being done and what metrics are being used, there's ample opportunity for abuse. And while I understand the discomfort with it being a sort of no man's land, I am inclined to side with those that would rather there be a no man's land in lieu of a really transparent standard that is being uniformly applied than a means it's trusting in the ideological bearings of the Trump administration, the Biden administration, or Mark Zuckerberg as a human being.
There are people who write on Substack that are not monetized but are given a platform. And I've heard you use this phrase before, that daylight is the best disinfectant. There's some kind of utility to allowing people to express these hideous views so that we do in fact know that they exist, rather than concealing their politics and us having to kind of guess what's behind the curtain. They're not monetized on these platforms, because they're privately owned. But there are examples in the past. I can think of maybe Father Coughlin as like the original Twitch streamer, where people would use the United States Postal Service to mail in dollar bills to support his radio program. And that was, his First Amendment rights on the media communication network of the time. Should these people be demonetized, even if they are indeed hosted, but should they be demonetized on the platforms themselves?
I think I'm inclined toward platform neutrality. I don't think that that's the problem. To
Demonetization.
Your point, yeah, I think to your point, people can figure out how to get paid the way they want to get paid. Something really interesting is happening right now where, again, I could be wrong, but it feels like the politics of Twitter, which is where I live. I can't speak as much to the other platforms, but the politics of Twitter, the sort of unsettledness, the obviousness of Elon Musk's political agenda and the open race science and skull measuring that's happening on that app, it's getting to a point that it's jumping the shark, right? It feels like even your run-of-the-mill conservative Republican populist, not even like mainstream Republican, is like, oh, well, I kind of don't want our tax dollars going to Ukraine, but I don't know that I support skull measuring and saying that everyone who is not a white male who should be sent back to Africa. Like that. I don't know that that's quite the agenda that I bought into. We live in a pluralistic society. I have a, Latino stepdaughter. Like, I don't know that this is the vibe. Yeah. And I do wonder, to the sunlight is the best disinfectant point, if there's something of a heel turn that we're going to experience precisely because they've gotten over their skis. Do you remember back in the first Trump campaign when the discourse was like, what does this secret Pepe mean? Like all of this, it was stuff that was happening out of sight. You're like, is this a white supremacist signal?
Right.
Like,
yeah.
There was this idea that there was that Trump was unexpected because a conversation was happening on Reddit that wasn't happening in real life, or 4chan, or
definitely 4chan. Yeah, not Reddit. But
sorry,
yes.
Sorry. Yeah. I was a very normie lawyer girl who wasn't paying that much attention to any of that back then, especially.
Probably better off for it.
But who knows? Time will tell. But I think there's an argument that at least now we have a better sense of what we're contending with. And I think it's good that people are doing it on these bro podcasts and everyone can make an assessment about where the lines are and what kind of lines are actually being transgressed in real life. I think liberals for a long time were so alarmist about like the Joe Rogan stuff.
Yeah.
And conflating it with some of the actual dark stuff.
Right.
They lost some credibility. But now I think everyone's in a little bit of a better position to say, okay, Theo Von and Joe Rogan aren't necessarily going to be the end of the world. Although Joe Rogan is taking a bit of a turn, but that's neither here nor there. They're not going to be the end of the world. But there is some really gross stuff that I think is the Elons getting over their skis that might result in a little bit of a course correction.
Exploring these questions of free speech, there was a famous example that were hotly contested debates back on Facebook, allowing Holocaust deniers to post their beliefs, which is grotesque, but it's not illegal in the United States. Should we support something like that from a left freedom of speech position?
What's the alternative?
Appoint somebody to be the fact checker, have moderation.
Here's what I'll say, tie into the conversation we were having about The Hill. When I tried to have Norm Finkelstein on, I was told we could not have him as a guest because he is a Holocaust denier.
What? That isn't right.
Norm Finkelstein, whose parents survived the Warsaw Ghetto, is a Holocaust denier. Now, the argument is, as I understand it, that he wrote this book that I think in part talks about how, like the Holocaust industry, people who will weaponize the horror of the Holocaust for Zionism or other kinds of objectives that are incongruent morally, et cetera. Or, something along those lines. And any conversation about, what the numbers of people who were killed are, not denying obviously the enormity of it, gets characterized as Holocaust denial in that book, right? But the argument that was presented to me when I say, can I have the foremost scholar on Gaza on our show who happens to be a Jewish man whose parents were victims of the Holocaust or survivors of the Holocaust, is that he is a Holocaust denier. So yeah, I'm skeptical of how that gets policed, to say the least.
Yeah. What about not in the United States, but in a country like Germany, where saying something like that is illegal? Should we allow people to post those things on social media?
I think Germany is exactly the example of why this kind of a policy is so dangerous. You're having Jewish pro-Palestine professors, journalists, activists rounded up in the streets because their advocacy for Palestine is being characterized as anti-Semitic. I had a really compelling guest on at some point last year who was the head of the BDS's focus on weapons embargoes. And his partner had been arrested for social media posts, if I recall correctly, that were pro-Palestine. Is that what we want America to look like? Are we really trusting in this media environment, in this political environment, where the priority of our Congress in a bipartisan way is to sanction people like and censor people like Rashida Tlaib as agenda number one, and to adopt the anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism definition of anti-Semitism? That's the country we live in, and we want those kinds of folks to be policing what it means to be anti-Semitic? We look at the Twitter policies as they're being implemented currently. And, how many times have you seen someone tweet, something inward, and then you reply, well, shut up, honky, or whatever. And the honky part gets, censored, or, and the inward part doesn't. I mean, all of this is so subjective. So I'm sorry, the sensitivity of this conversation is that if you say something shouldn't be censored, that is obviously objectionable, you sound like you're condoning the underlying premise. But I'm sorry, I have zero degree of trust in the ability of people in the systems that we have, whether it's our political system or these social media companies, to do any kind of censorship or regulation in a way that is consistent, transparent, and fair. I don't. None. We're having this conversation in the shadow of a pending TikTok ban.
Right.
The cause of that ban is not obscure.
It's published in the Wall Street Journal, which is fucking crazy that they said it.
They're
Even
just
if that was
making
the
it.
case, they just told them themselves.
He admitted it.
Oh, come
it's
on.
The meme.
Just be like, oh yeah, we lobbied really hard for this. We made the case and convinced people. They're just like, well, Palestine posts are 70-1. That's all. They just fucking said
We're losing. We're big
Crazy.
losers. So let's cancel the app. It's pathetic, but here we are, and they have the power to do it. So yeah, I'm like, and this is a double-edged sword, right? Because this is the argument about the utility of kind of independent media for revolutionary change. Yeah, they'll let you have it until you're effective. They'll let you talk until you're actually making a difference. When I was fired from Rising, I was happy. I'm not gonna, I didn't hate the paycheck, but I knew it was coming. I knew because of Katie, it was a matter of time. When Katie was fired, I said this on my show, we talked about it together, and I said it on Rising because a condition of me staying was being allowed to do a radar that addressed it. Yeah. That I did not believe the Hill's reasoning that it was a ideologically neutral decision. I said that's BS. That's clearly not true.
Of course.
That being said, I am going to test this premise, and I will be talking about this particular issue without restraint, and we will see if I get fired or not. And of course, it took a little bit of time. No one could have predicted that October 7th was going to come in the mix there and really foreground the issue in that way. But the writing's on the wall. So yeah, I was allowed to have that platform until it became too inconvenient. Our political circumstances changed, and somebody somewhere didn't want me saying those things and advocating for Palestine persuasively with the reach that I had on that show to a bipartisan audience that had a very healthy appetite for a more kind of protectionist foreign policy.
Yeah.
They didn't want it, so they stopped it. And I think that if you're not getting fired, if you're not under some real pressure, then maybe your politics aren't as revolutionary as you think that they are.
Yeah.
If AOC is getting the cover of whatever magazine hugged up with Mama Bear, maybe that starts to be an indicator of the threat level she does or does not pose. If the Democratic Party for the first time runs a commercial against Jill Stein, maybe that should tell you a little bit something about the upward pressure that they're facing and how close their margins are and how panicked they are about the election and where some of the votes that they need are actually going. I welcome their hatred.
You mentioned TikTok before. Do you think that having TikTok in the US was ever a sustainable premise?
What do you mean, sustainable?
Well, I mean, as soon as it came in, people were talking about banning it for one reason or another. I mean, my sense is that Israel-Gaza is like the excuse to do this thing that they had been trying to do for a long while.
My experience with that argument has largely been establishment actors upset that true things that are being said that happen to be critical of the establishment, that are also being said by a foreign actor. They're like, well, you're listening to Russia. I'm like, well, is the underlying thing true? So let me be specific. There was this moment during the Bernie campaign, I got a little in trouble because some journalist asked me when I was National Press Secretary how I felt about all of the Russian bots that were targeting Black Americans, arguing that America was racist. I was like, I don't know that we needed a Russian bot to tell us this, but one way to get to the bottom of that is like to not be racist, to deal with the structural problems that people are complaining about. I don't know that Russia, to the extent that there is somebody trying to exploit a reality, I got a quick solve for you.
Yeah.
Not a quick solve, but a solve.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think it's similar to RT in that this was amplifying narratives that would make rigorous arguments. In some cases, they would say true things, but in an attempt to narrow the parameters of the Overton window, they just got rid of RT on all of the Google platforms, YouTube, Meta, you name it. RT is still on TikTok today, actually. But I think they're going to take down TikTok as just a whole platform because it has this problem of expanding the Overton window. Right now, it's to the left, but it could be to the right in different cases. And similar to RT, just amplifying, dissident narratives within a country. This just seems like a kind of plausible, useful strategy.
Governments have been using cultural products to affect cultural, political attitudes since time immemorial, doing color revolutions, amplifying abstract art over representational worker-based art, co-opting jazz musicians and giving them funding to have less radical music and go on these America is equal racial pluralistic society here, go on a tour of Africa and prove how not racist America is, doing these sorts of things always. The thing about social media is that there's a little bit of an opportunity for gumshoe randoms to do the same thing back, to have a little bit of influence, to start a hashtag, to do a Black Lives Matter, to tell people to meet in Ducati Park. Like there's a little bit of equalizing. Now, I don't want to overstate that because, again, ultimately the power lies in the people who control these platforms. And we see, we won on Palestine on TikTok and they shut down TikTok. It's limited. But it is hard for me to shake a stick at. It is hard for me not to be, positive about there being a little bit of democracy and a little bit of an ability to world build for the regular people who don't have access to the CIA. Like, I can't hate it. I can't knock it. I wouldn't overinvest in it. I wouldn't say you can depend on TikTok to shepherd in the revolution, but it's a tool. And while it's at our disposal, I'm happy it exists, I guess.
Yeah, for now, I think it's very useful. I'm a little bit of a pessimist that its days may be numbered. Perhaps even by the time this podcast
I can
comes
tell.
out.
We're having a little bit of a cat dog, optimist, pessimist situation. I'm trying so hard not to ask you your sign, Josh.
I'm pessimaxing. I'm a neurotopilled, pessimaxed, I don't know, whatever J-Reg said on the podcast. I'm that. going to Spare Corps, something like that. Whatever he said. Speaking of pessimaxing, being on the left is a very frustrating experience. We are going through a pretty bad period now, and for the foreseeable future, we have a long road ahead of us, very much an uphill battle. What do you think is possible to achieve within our lifetimes? What do you think are realistic goals that you hope to accomplish? What keeps you motivated to do it?
I know what I'm supposed to say. I'm supposed to say that the arc of history is long and it bends toward justice if we bend it. And to think that anything that's going to happen in the short term is deeply naive, and it discounts the sort of work and investment that people need to put in.
It doesn't bend towards justice. That's...
I believe, from like an ideological perspective, that you have to have optimism. I believe that you have to aspire to a shorter term horizon, even if practically speaking, you're building blocks for a longer term window. I think that in 2014, I could not have fathomed the existence of Bernie Sanders as a viable presidential candidate.
Right.
And I certainly couldn't have fathomed that he won, 44% of the votes or whatever he got in 2016 with a campaign that he didn't even believe in the beginning. And would not have imagined that 2020 would go the way that it went, with the heart attack and the comeback and the rally and Queen. Like there were these moments where we seemed so close. I wouldn't have imagined that something like Medicare for All would have an 88% approval rate within the Democratic Party and like a 60 whatever percent overall, with almost, I think, 49% of Republicans supporting it. I wouldn't have imagined that October 7th would have happened, and within months, the public opinion on the state of Israel would swing so radically in a way that was like a death knell, frankly, for Zionism as an ideological project. Right. I could never imagine that Katie got fired from the Hill for basically saying Israel is an apartheid state, and now we're having regular open debates about whether Israel does have a right to exist. So it is hard for me, given that reality, to sit here and be like, I think I'm going to die, hopefully a very long time from now, and we're going to be constructively where we are currently. I cannot believe that. I don't see the social utility in believing that. I was raised in a secular household. I have been attracted to arguments of late about the role of spirituality on the left, whether or not it's necessary for us to kind of take the sorts of leaps and make the sorts of commitments that are necessary, I think, for us not to be desensitized into the status quo, or to commit ourselves to a longer horizon that is necessarily even necessary, and to withhold ourselves from exploiting possibilities when they spring up, like a Bernie Sanders campaign. I am concerned that if another kind of historical figure like that were to emerge, that the left would just be infighting over whether or not they had some bad take in 2003, because they're so doomer-pilled and depressed over having believed in something once or twice and that project having failed. And they're embarrassed about it. They're embarrassed about having had that faith at one time. And I think that's very, very sad. So yeah, I end my show saying keep the faith, even though half the time I am truly spiraling in the context of my own podcast, because I think that that's a commitment that we have to make. And I would rather die naively hoping that we could have done something better and that we were going to achieve my Star Trek utopia than have been resigned to not having achieved anything at all, or not having achieved much at all.
Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Your work is an inspiration.
Really, it's great to be in conversation with you.